a series of studies in the book of Ecclesiastes. We pointed out as we introduced that study that the book of Ecclesiastes is a very practical book for our everyday walks of life. We talked about some of those key phrases that the wise man Solomon uses time and time again, such as vanity, that is something that is a mist or a vapor or fleeting, and Solomon is focused about life under the sun. That phrase occurs 29 times, and then under heaven 3 times, as it is translated in the New King James. And so Solomon is trying to talk about what makes for the best life here, because Solomon would point out early in this epistle, and what last week in chapters 1 and 2, that something is missing in the life of Solomon. He's trying to figure out what is going to make life complete or whole. There's a void that is there, and we saw last week in chapter 2 that Solomon tried what we refer to as the 5 W's. He tried wine or pleasure, women, wealth, wisdom of the earthly kind, and his conclusion was, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind, for there was no profit under the sun. Verse 11 of chapter 2. As we continue our study in Ecclesiastes, we're going to turn our attention to the next 2 chapters and turn our attention to Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and chapter 4. We'll cover both of those here tonight. Just a reminder, though, before we get into these chapters, that what we're looking at tonight is the first 2/3 of second discourse. Using the discourses as Kaiser and Waldron outline them, the second discourse covers chapters 3 through 5, and we're covering the first 2 of those chapters in discourse 2 this evening. And so if you haven't already, turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, put a marker there, though we'll be spending our time there. We'll be spending our time in 3 and 4 here this evening. So I encourage you to put your marker there and follow along with me. That's what I have to say. Again, I want to remind everyone what we mentioned this morning about our plans for Ecclesiastes. Normally next week, being the first Sunday of the month, we are singing. We'll continue our series next week with chapters 5 and 6, and then the singing tonight is going to be the second Sunday of the month of November. We'll continue the study that week, and then we'll take a break for a week, and then we'll come back to it again. As we get ready for Ecclesiastes chapter 3, the title I would give Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is God's Providential Control. When you start reading the passages, like Griffin read for us a moment ago in 1-8, that there's a time for everything, what is Solomon saying? Well, Solomon is ultimately pointing out that God has providential control. God has allowed time for everything, and God's in control. Not that he's forcing us to do one thing or another, but he has allotted the time we could occupy ourselves with these things. And the ultimate point is going to come in 14 and 15, that I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it that men should fear before him. That which has already been, and that is to be, or what is to be has already been, and God requires an account of what is past. Whatever God does, it shall be forever. God is one in providential control. As we study this chapter here this evening, starting in chapter 3, and then we'll cover chapter 4. Chapter 3, 1 to 15, is a section I would title, There's a Time for Everything. And that's really what Solomon drives at when he talks about there being this, that everything has its season in 1-8. He begins in verse 1 by saying, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. He then in 2-8 will list what those are, some of those are, and we'll go to that more in a minute. Solomon begins by pointing out that everything has a season and purpose. Now we're going to jump ahead of ourselves for a moment, but again, 9 and 10, what profit has the worker for that in which he labors? I've seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. He has made everything beautiful in its time. The point ultimately is God has created time for us to do where we can do these different things and allot them for different things. Some of them obviously beyond our control, some within our control of what we choose to do. And there's that time there that we have the choice of what to do when. And so beginning at verse 2, there's a time to be born and a time to die. There's a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, to kill and to heal, to break down and build up, to weep and to laugh, to mourn and to dance, to cast stones and gather stones, to embrace and refrain from embracing. That's what he covers in 2 to 5 of that section. I'll list the rest of those on their slide in just a moment. But when you think about the fact that in life, there's a time to be born and a time to die. There's the statement that we often hear, there are two things certain in life: death, taxes. When you think about it, that there's really two realities that happen. If Christ doesn't come back first, there are two things that's going to happen to everybody. Everybody's born, everybody dies. That's going to happen. Regardless of how long we live, if Christ does not return first, everybody's born and everybody is going to die. Now, there's a time to plant things. There's a time to pluck what is planted or to pick what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. Obviously, not saying that we should be killing other people, but the point that he's ultimately making here in this whole section of 1 to 8 is that God has allotted the time where we have the time to choose and do whatever we do with it. There's a time to gain and lose, verse 6, to keep and throw away, to tear and to sow, to keep silence and to speak. There's a time to love and to hate, and a time of war to time. There's a time in life in which all of these things can happen. There is a time in which anything can be taking place. God has allotted the time to where we keep doing all of these things. The point really of chapter 3 is that God has in his providence, or that God is in providential control, and we've got to learn that we fit somewhere in God's plan. Now, it doesn't mean that God controls our every move and we have no choice, but God has providential role, and that God has allotted the times for us to do these things. God's the one ultimately in control. Something we've been driving home as we studied the book of Revelation. And what we have to understand, in the point of 9 to 15, really the heart of this chapter is we've got to learn to trust God's providence. There's a time for everything. And we've got to learn that all things are beautiful in their time, and that we cannot, and that no one can find out the work that God does. Look at verse 9 through 11. What profit has the work from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task with which the sons of men are to be occupied. Again, I think the point, God has allotted the times in which you can occupy yourself with any of these things. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Verse 11. There's a time and a place for all of these things. And not even just thinking about the list, but when you think about everything in life, it fits in. There's a time to go to work. There's a time to go home from work. Right? There's a time to eat, and there's a time for everything in life. And the point is, there are these tasks with which the sons of men are to be occupied and can occupy themselves with, and everything is beautiful in its time. Verse 11, also he's put eternity into their hearts, except that no one can find the earth that God does from the beginning to an end. It's Wiersbe that points out that really sort of summarizing the section is God has created a time for everything and is in providential control. And we may not understand how we fit into God's plan, but we know we're in there somewhere. And then in eternity, perhaps we'll find out where we fit in. That God has put eternity in the man, except no one can find out the work that God does from the beginning to the end. And I think as we get later in the chapter, we come back to the transitoriness of man at the end of the chapter. It helps us understand that idea that Solomon early in this book has been alluding to the fact that there's something God simply like under the sun. God has put eternity into their hearts, but no one can find out the work God does from beginning to end. We know that there's eternity. We know we fit so in God's plan, but where exactly is that? We don't know. So what should we do? Verse 12. We should enjoy life understanding that everything and all the time we have is a gift from God. I know that nothing is better for them than to rejoice and to do good in their lives. And also, every man should eat, drink, and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is a gift of God. What's Solomon's point? God has appointed a time for everything. And we need to allot that time to use wisely, realizing we fit somewhere in God's plan. We need to learn, too, that it's okay to enjoy life when we understand that life and everything in it is a gift from God. Again, going back to what he said in verse 1, that everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. Why? Because it's a gift from God. That time is a gift from God. How we choose to use that time, what we use it for, is a gift from God. The God-given task, verse 10, with which sons of men are to be occupied. So verse 14, understand this, that ultimately, regardless of what we do, God's purpose and will be accomplished. I know that whatever God does, it shall be forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. God does it. The men should fear before him. That which has already been and what is to be has already been. And God requires an account of what is past. As you think about Solomon and Solomon's struggle here in Ecclesiastes, Solomon has been trying to figure out about life and what makes for the best life. And so really what Solomon has been trying to figure out is, how do I fit somewhere in God's plan? And what he's learning as he's going throughout the book is that time that I have is a gift from God, and I don't know where I fit in that in God's providential plan, but I know this, that I fit in there somewhere, and I've got to trust God, knowing that whatever God is forever. Ultimately, God's purpose is going to accomplish. Regardless of what man tries, it will ultimately be accomplished. It's then he says in verse 16, the second section, he talks about the wickedness of man, where he says, moreover, I saw under the sun, in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. And in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every word. God has given the time, everything its season. And again, we have the choice of how to use that time. God's not making us robots that he's controlling and we have no choice. God's given us a choice of how to use that time that he's given us. And he saw under the sun that in the place of judgment, wickedness was there. And in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. God's given us the time to use wisely. And how's man chosen to use that? Man's chosen to use it for his own wants and his own desires and wickedness. And so God will judge the righteous and God will judge the wicked. For there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. However we use our time, God may give us the time to use with whatever we desire, but we're going to give an answer for how we've used that time. Then Solomon reminds those he's writing to of the transitoriness of man. Life is temporary. That's why we've got to be concerned about the account we're going to get. That's why we've got to be concerned with how we've used. There may be a time for everything, but how did we use that time? How did we use that season? Did we use it for the right purpose? Life is temporary. We've got to understand that. We're going to give an account. We've got to understand that. I said in my heart, verse 18, concerning the condition of sons of men, God tests them. They may see that they themselves are like animals. For what happens to the son of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them, as one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity. All go to one place, all are from dust, and all return to dust. Now, in verse 21, he's going to come to this idea of there being something beyond this life, already alluded to earlier in in this chapter, or stated earlier in this chapter. But Solomon's really pointing out in 18 to 20 that the way we may look at life from the earthly standpoint is like life. There's no difference between us and between an animal. That is, man, if he's looking at it simply from the earthly standpoint, sees here's an animal and the animal dies. Here's a man and the man dies. And what's the difference? The idea that, well, that must be all there is, because we do not see that soul returning to God. Again, we're jumping a little bit ahead of ourselves, but remember this in chapter 12, verse 7, then the dust will return to the earth it was. What he said happens with the animals. What he said happens with man. But here's the difference in man and animal. The spirit will return to God who gave it, Ecclesiastes 12, and in verse 7. So man's like the animals, at least from how we may look at it from the earthly standpoint, in that an animal's born, and what happens to that animal? It's eventually going to die. What happens to man? He's born, he's eventually going to die. What happens after that animal dies? The body decays and it turns to dust. What happens to man? The body decays and it turns to dust. And so the thought is, well, there's no difference. Verse 21, who knows the spirit of the sons of men which go upward, and the spirit of the animal unto the earth? Again, I think alluding to, or keep in mind what he says later in chapter 12. There may seem to be no difference, but you know what? There's one very major difference. When an animal dies, that's it. That's their end. Man dies, soul returns to God who gave you. And there must be an account then for whether that we use our time for righteousness or wickedness. He mentions in verse 17. So what should happen in verse 22? So I perceive that nothing is bad, that a man should wish in his works, for that is heritage, for who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Enjoy life, use the time wisely, but enjoy life. Because you don't know what's going to come after you. When you die, that's the end of your physical life, and spirit returns to God gave it. So the point of Ecclesiastes 3 is this: God is in providential control. We fit somewhere in his plan, even though we may not know where. But what we do know this: while God has given us a time for everything, his providential control has allotted us the time to do with whatever we desire, we do still have to give an account for how we've chosen to use that time when our life on earth is over. That's a run through Ecclesiastes 3. Let's go to chapter 4 now and come back and talk about some practical application. Chapter 4, I simply taught vanity of toil. Again, I saw that for all the toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Solomon begins by talking about the oppression of man. Then I returned and considered all the oppression that is done under the sun, and looked at the tears of the oppressed, but they have no comforter. On the side of their oppressors there is power, but they have no comforter. There's some in life who are being oppressed for what they've, that are being oppressed in life. Their tears, there are tears of their oppressed, comforted. And on the side of their oppressors, there's power, but the one being oppressed, there's no comfort. At least that's from an earthly standpoint. Solomon concluded in verse 2, I praised the dead who were already dead more than the living who are still alive. His thought was, if that's the way it is in life, it'd be better to be dead than suffering oppression without any sense of comfort. Yet better than both is he who has never existed, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Better than the one that's passed on and not have to worry about the oppression. He says one never born that had never had to deal with it at all in the first place. That's an idea that we have by those. Job himself had that idea when Job was suffering oppression. You know what? It'd be better if I was just never born at all. And so Solomon says, I see the oppression that's going on, and my thought is, you know what? It would be better not to be in this earth than to suffer oppression, because it seems like there is no comfort. Verse 4 then, again, I saw that for all toil and every skillful work, a man is envied by his neighbor. Solomon says, when I start looking at life and all the things of life, and really that's what chapter 4 is. Chapter 4 is almost Solomon again. You picturing, viewing, or zooming out, looking at an overview of life and saying, I'm seeing oppression, I'm seeing those who strive for riches and instead have no friendship. That's not as good as having friendship. I see the vanity of popularity that we're going to get to at the end of the chapter. And Solomon, as he zooms out and looks at life, has the idea of, from this earth standpoint, it just looks very doom and gloom, if you will. Like there's nothing good. I saw the toil of every skillful work of a man, and he's envied by his neighbor. So is vanity and grasping for the wind. Trying to toil and earn all those things, that's like grasping for the wind. It's temporary. What happens is, instead of enjoying, you are envied by your neighbor. The fool holds his hand and consumes his own flesh. The fool is trying not to work, so he says, okay, one says, I work and I toil, and that's vanity. And the fool over here says, I'm not going to work, and instead consumes his own flesh. What's the solution? Better a handful with quietness than both hands full to toil and grasping for the wind. Better to have a little, be wise and quiet, than be toiling for the things under the sun that are going for trying to toil for the things that you really have. They're going to eventually be gone and fleeting. We toil for them, but soon they are gone. Then I returned and I saw the vanity under the sun. Again, time and time again, Solomon talks about the vanity. We just saw the vanity of toil. He talked about how there's oppression under the sun, which led him to consider the vanity of toiling for things under the sun, and now vanity of striving for riches. It's closely connected. As you toil for things under the sun, man toils trying to acquire riches. So I to return, and I saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone without companion. He has neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches, but he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. As you think we skipped, as you think about the vanity, there should be a slide there for the third one for verse 8. Verse 7 and 8 is the vanity of striving for riches. And Solomon says, I see the man striving for riches and striving for all the things. And you know what? He's over here striving, but he has no companion. Who's there to offer friendship to this one who becomes so consumed with things of this life? I kind of picture the man of 7 and 8. He's the kind of man that he's going to make sure that he betters himself. You know what? If he's got to work around the clock 24/7, if he's got to take extra shifts and there's no time for anything else, that's what they're going to do. And as he's toiling for all of it, finds himself, verse 9, to be alone. No son or no brother. And yet, despite the fact there's nobody, I think in part, there's nobody to turn and even leave it to. Remember what we've seen already? We're toiling, and what happens? Leave it for somebody else. He don't even have any family or friends to leave it to. Yet there's no end to his labor. His eye is not satisfied. I've known somebody that said, you know what? If I could just have this one thing, I'd be happy or satisfied. Then they get that one thing. And then, if I just had this one more thing, then I'd be satisfied. And they get that thing. It's sad to me. I like watching sports, and it's sad to me the number of NFL players through the years that I've heard of who made millions upon millions of dollars in their playing days who are completely bankrupt because they went and they spent it, and the more they had, the more they tried to get, and then they spent beyond their means, even though they had great means, because the eye was never satisfied. So man may be alone and have no friendship, and instead he's striving for all of these things under the sun, things that are, verse 8, vanity. Striving for them is a grave misfortune. Footnote of the New King James says literally it's the path. No benefit to it. But instead of being alone and striving for riches, listen to verse 9, two are better than one. Often we talk about companions, we talk about friends, and we talk about it from the negative standpoint. And the reason we do that is we're trying to warn particularly young people, watch who your friends are. Don't be unequally yoked, 2 Corinthians 6 and 7. Go to passage 1 Corinthians 15. Bad company corrupts good morals. We go to Proverbs. Look what Solomon told John about those that he associated with and where they may lead him. While we need to warn about the negative standpoint, sometimes we need to realize there's a good side to friendship. Two are better than one because they have a good reward for their labor. Friendship, good friend, be rewarding, not a burden pulling us down. For if the one fall, one will lift him up, or lift up his companion. But woe to him who alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. What happens if you're out for a walk and you're by yourself and you fall? Maybe you don't have your phone. Now we all have our phone on us. We can call somebody. But what if you don't have your phone on? Your battery of your phone, and you fall and you're out somewhere where you can't get help. You got to sit there and hope that eventually somebody comes on along. What if two go together and one falls? Well, the second one can help lift them up. If they can't, they can go find help. They can find somebody to help lift them up. What if somebody's trying to overpower another individual and the person is alone? They may be overpowered, but if there's two, most of the time, unless a really strong person and it's somebody that they're just not physically able to match with, typically two people can overpower one person. And then threefold cord is not quickly broken, even better three. Friendship is rewarding. So what I think as you look at what Solomon's saying in verses 7 and 8, as we look at this section before about how riches, the vanity of riches and how they don't satisfy, there are those who are alone and have no companion because all they do is they toil and they toil and they toil, trying to get all of these riches of life, and in the end they find themselves alone when true value is found in friendship. When we associate with those who are good. Jonathan strengthened the hand of David. Perhaps as Solomon is writing, perhaps he heard the stories. Jonathan had long since died before Solomon was born, but perhaps Solomon had heard his father tell of Jonathan and how Jonathan had encouraged him. Maybe he heard about the stories about Nathan, who Nathan's not necessarily called David's friend, but there seems to be a friendship between the prophet Nathan and David, that Nathan can say things to David that others just simply couldn't. And to see Nathan be the man that looks at David and says, David, you are the man, causing David to change. Maybe those kinds of things run through Solomon's mind as he thinks about his father, stories he heard, and the good friends that he had who helped to lift him up, not physically, but spiritually, to lift him up. There's great value in friendship. This Solomon concludes with this: the vanity of popularity. Better a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who'll be admonished no more. For he comes out of prison to be king, although he was born poor in the kingdom. I saw all the living who walk under the sun. They were with the second youth who stands in his place. There was no end of all the people over whom he was a king, yet those who come afterward will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. Got a picture of 13 through 16 that Solomon painting. You've got this older king who now he's kind of foolish, or at least the people think he's foolish. And now here comes this poor wise man, or at least the people think he's wise. He's coming from prison, but you know what? The people are sold on him, and so guess what? He's going to be the ruler. Guess what's going to eventually happen to that wise, poor, new king? Well, eventually he'll grow older, and maybe the next generation doesn't view him as so wise, They, like the one before, view him as as others viewed the previous king, view him as a fool, and now something else comes along that's more appealing. I saw the living under the sun. There were with the second youth who stands on the earth, there was an end, or there was no end of all the people over whom he would make king. He's king, and guess what? As long as he's king, there's still people under him, but guess what's going to happen to him? He's eventually going to become the foolish old king instead of the wise young king in the eyes of the people. And then they'll go for something new. And so here's something else. They're kind of moving by every shiny object, if you will. What's the point? Well, you don't put your trust in popularity. The wise king becomes the foolish king. The wise youth will eventually become that foolish king. And the popularity that they once had is something that is going to go away. Those who come after will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity. His popularity that made him rise to power, guess what? That faded away. It was vanity, just like striving for those riches, just like toiling for the things under the sun were vanity. They came and they were fleeting. So what are some practical lessons we learn from Ecclesiastes 3 and 4? Well, we need to learn first and foremost that ultimately God's the one in control. It's his will that's going to be done. His purpose is going to be accomplished. Now, man may not want to try to fit in God's plan. Man may not want to try to be what he needs to be. But regardless of what man does, God's purpose, or whatever God does, shall be forever. His purpose will be accomplished. The second lesson I learned from verse 17 of chapter 3 that someday we're going to be judged. Again, as you think about the picture of chapter 3, there's a time and a season for everything. And again, he talked about in verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal. We said, killing, that's not something that's something we're not supposed to be doing. But guess what? If that's what man does with his time, and there have been plenty of people throughout history who chose to use time to kill and take the life of another. There have been many throughout history who chose to try to use their life to help others who were sick and injured. There have been plenty of people throughout time who were trying to build up things and others who were trying to break them down. There have been plenty of times throughout life with every individual where there's times of weeping and times of laughter. Where there's times of mourning and dancing. I don't think, again, literally dancing, but mourning and times of joy. Guess what? How we choose to use the time that God has given us. Verse 17. God's going to judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. Keep things in their time. Did we do with the time what we need to do with the time? God has created the time for everything to accomplish these tasks. Made everything beautiful in its time. Have we lived righteous with that time, though, or wicked? See, a third lesson I learned of the toil of life is vanity and for the wind. Everything we can work for and toil for in life, we try to find pleasure in and enjoyment in, it's vanity. It's grasping for the wind. Again, as we said, you try to grab the wind, not going to. You can run out there on a windy day and try to catch the wind with your hands. You can try to catch the wind in a jar. And however you try, you're not going to capture the wind. The point is, it's something that's going to get away. Hey, one more point. And the lunch years. I learned of the value of friendship, a true friendship, these two chapters. The value of associating with those who can truly comfort us and uplift us. A minute ago, perhaps Solomon, good friendships he had. Perhaps Solomon had in his mind himself the wives he had who pulled his heart away. Again, if we're right about our dating of the book, it seems that the book is written at the end of Solomon's life, and he's a wise man looking back. Solomon is looking here in his life, and he's looking back at everything he's done, saying, you know what? Everything I tried for and everything I strived for was vanity. Maybe Solomon's realizing now, you know what? There were some I associated with that weren't good friendship. There are others that are there that can help to lift me. We need to learn the value of friendship and associating with those who are good companions who can help to lift us up. That's Ecclesiastes, a quick survey of chapters 3 or 4 of Ecclesiastes. Lord willing, next Sunday evening, we'll continue our study by covering Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and chapter 6. As we come to a close now this evening, it may be that one or more present who may have never responded in obedience to the gospel. You're here and you've heard the word of God and you believe that Jesus is Christ, the Son of the living God. Do not repent of your sins, confess your faith in him, being buried in the waters of baptism, rise in the walk in the newness of life, having your sins forgiven. There's a time for every purpose under heaven. There's a time now for you to make that necessary change to serve God. And use that time wisely. Eventually, you're going to give an account for how you've lived. Why not, if you're here and you realize this evening you need to obey, why not do so this evening while you know you have opportunity? You're here and you've done it because somewhere along the line, I've not been as faithful as I need to be. I didn't use the time wisely and for righteousness, but for wickedness. The news is there's opportunity and there's a time now to make those corrections. The sin of a private nature, you can take it to the Lord privately in prayer. But if it's a sin of a public